our minds to new ideas and different perspectives, with power to spark emotions and inspire change. For centuries, stories have challenged us, and storytellers have helped us make sense of our world. In just 3 years, with 12 followers in a 10-square-mile area, one of the best storytellers on earth captivated crowds and answered questions with stories. Stories about yeast and mustard seeds, about wedding invitations and lost things, stories that feature laborers and Pharisees, tax collectors and Samaritans. Jesus told stories that literally turned ideas about life, love, and faith upside down and changed the world forever.
I'm going to start this morning by telling you a story that's a little bit embarrassing for me. But way back in seminary, my preaching professor taught that sometimes it's good to be a little vulnerable during your messages, even if it's embarrassing. So here we are. But before I tell you the embarrassing part, I want to back up and tell you about something else first, which is when my husband and I were engaged to be married, we went on this premarital couples retreat. There were maybe 12 couples who were there. All of us were looking to get married in the next 6 to 9 months. And we spent this weekend together as space to talk as partners and to prepare for our life. So we talked about finances, we talked about dreams, we talked about hopes, all those important conversations to have before you're married. And of course, a big chunk of the conversation was around conflict. How do you address, how do you resolve conflict in your marriage? Because any marriage, any relationship will experience conflict at some point. Sometimes it's the little things, the quibbles about who is supposed to unload the dishwasher, and sometimes it's the really big things when somebody ends up with a sense of really deep hurt or betrayal. No matter the conflict, a key part of a healthy relationship is learning how to recognize that and how to resolve them with care. So one of the practices we were taught on this marriage retreat is if somebody comes to you, if your partner comes to you and says, look, I'm feeling really hurt about whatever it is they feel hurt by, your task is to listen to them and then respond by saying, what I hear you saying is that you are really hurt by X, Y, and Z. And what this does is it keeps your conversation focused on exactly what the hurt is. It acknowledges that you've heard them. It helps minimize misunderstandings and mishearing. So somebody might say, when you don't help with the dishes after dinner, I feel like you don't care about our house and I'm all alone and doing all the chores. And the other partner responds, what I hear you saying is that when I don't help with the dishes, you feel alone and underappreciated. And you notice how it keeps that second person from reacting and keeps it focused on where the harm and the conflict is. And now you can have an open conversation about feeling isolated and alone rather than quibbling about dishes. You get the idea, right? So a number of years have gone by, and my husband and I have gotten pretty good at making our way through this routine, and we've resolved conflict well. And now we get to this point, and I am pregnant with our first child. And during this particular pregnancy, I'm having a lot of really vivid dreams. I'm generally not somebody that dreams and remembers them, but I remembered them, and they were clear. And one day, I woke up really mad. Like the second my eyes opened, I was angrier than I think I'd ever been in my life. I could hardly put words to what I was feeling mad about. And eventually I remembered that I had had this dream, and in my dream, my spouse and I had fought. Now, I knew it was a dream, and we didn't fight in real life, but I was still really angry. I was worked up. My body was reacting to this. The fight wasn't real, but the feelings sure were. So I turned to my spouse, who, by the way, is incredibly patient and kind, and I say to him, I had this dream last night, and in my dream, you said some pretty mean things to me, and now I'm feeling upset, and I'm having a hard time calming myself down, even though I know it wasn't a real fight. My spouse, in a well-rehearsed voice, says, what I hear you saying is that you're mad at me for something I said to you in a dream. And I said, yeah, basically. And he said, but you know we didn't really fight, and I didn't really say those mean things. And I said, yes, I do. And then when most partners would laugh it off and walk out of the room, my husband turns to me, he takes my hand, and he says with complete sincerity, "Honey, I am so sorry for what I said in your dream. I never want to hurt you." He apologized for something he said that hurt me that didn't even happen in real life. I told you he was patient and kind. But it had the desired effect. My body calmed down, my emotions settled, and I was able to find some peace. Our conflict, even though it wasn't real, found resolution. Forgiveness is an experience of having healing within ourselves and within a relationship. It helps us resolve conflict, and it's an expression of care for one another. Forgiveness helps pave the way for a deeper understanding, a deeper relationship, and a deeper understanding of who we are and to whom we belong. Now, God created us in community and in relationship with one another, and God made us in love, desiring that we know what it is to be loved fully. You'll remember what it says, how it defines love in 1 Corinthians 13. It says, "Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. Love does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." But the only way we can experience this kind of love is if we also practice and experience forgiveness. So as we heard in our scripture today, it begins with Peter coming to Jesus and asking him, how many times are we to forgive? Up to 7 times, he says. I think this is a fair question. We know how much big and small conflicts can weigh upon us, how we can worry that forgiveness will wear us down or that we'll be taken advantage of because of our generosity. We know the weight of conflict and pain. At what point do we just say, enough? Peter begins by establishing what I think he feels is a rather high bar of forgiveness. Should I forgive someone as many times as 7? I mean, giving somebody a second chance is generous, but 7 chances? But Jesus, as he often does, poses a radical suggestion. Not 7 times, but 77 times are we to forgive. And of course, what Jesus is saying is that we don't need a larger ledger to keep track of offenses. We are meant to throw the ledger out, to forgive again and again without keeping count. To further make his point, Jesus tells a story. And like many of his parables, this is a hyperbole, which means he gives an example that is so exaggerated that the underlying message becomes clear. Jesus tells us about a servant of the king who owes the monarch an immense amount of money, 10,000 bags of gold. This is just a huge sum. It's large enough that one commentary I read this week said it was more than the national debt of a small country. Another person said it was such a large amount of money that their family would be in debt for generations to come. It would be impossible for them to pay this debt. And so the servant begs the king for forgiveness, and the king, in this outrageous act of generosity and mercy, forgives this unpayable debt. So now the servant who has been forgiven goes back home and encounters another person who owes him a smaller amount of money, 100 silver coins. Now, this might be, this isn't nothing, but it's a payable amount. You could save for it. You could create a payment plan. It's something that they would be expected to be able to figure out a way. And the second person asks the first servant for forgiveness, to be forgiven their debt as well. But the first servant, who has already been forgiven this incredible debt, refuses and has the second servant thrown into jail. When the forgiven servant refuses to extend compassion, the king becomes angry and says, "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?" He was forgiven this unimaginable amount and yet was unwilling to offer even a small amount of mercy to someone else. Throughout this parable, Jesus is drawing a picture for us of God's compassion and mercy. that our God is so generous, so compassionate and merciful towards us, so forgiving towards us, that it is impossible for us to keep count. No matter how large our debt, no matter how big we mess up, God responds with forgiveness and mercy. Jesus says to Peter, if you understand the depths of God's forgiving love, you will no longer count how many times you have forgiven. Instead, forgiveness will become just a part of your life. It will reshape your actions and your behaviors and your emotions because you will respond with grace in the same way that you have received grace. But if we're honest, I think we can all say that living in such a way is pretty difficult. We all have likely much more in common with the servant who, having been forgiven, struggles to extend that same mercy and forgiveness to someone else. It's much easier to receive forgiveness and grace than it is to extend it to others. Have you been in situations where it's difficult or hard to imagine forgiving? If you do, you're not alone. Many years ago, I worked with a couple experiencing a lot of hurt and pain in their relationship. And neither one of them were able to forgive the other person because they felt like it was a sign of weakness to offer forgiveness to their partner. They both felt like if they forgave the other person, it would be used against them. It would be a way that they could be hurt again in the future. And so instead of offering forgiveness and experiencing that, they clung to those ledgers of wrongdoing as if that could be their guide. And I don't know about your experience, but I find that ledgers of wrongdoing tend to guide us toward more trouble and discontent rather than peace. What is it that keeps us from extending mercy to one another? Sometimes I think we withhold forgiveness because of our own fear. We think that holding back will somehow protect us against future hurt, or that holding back and keeping forgiveness, that if we were to forgive, it would be a sign of weakness, and we don't want to project that in the world. Sometimes I wonder if we feel that offering mercy so generously is somehow unfair, that perhaps this person is unworthy of our compassion, or that if we forgive, we will somehow run out of compassion and generosity. And sometimes I think we are unable to forgive others because we're unable to forgive ourselves and are still bound with hurt and pain and resentment, and we just can't find another way. Now, while many of these feel true for us and can be real struggles for us, I want to remind us that forgiveness is not a limited resource. Forgiveness will never run out. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but it takes an incredible amount of strength and courage to be vulnerable and to offer grace, to experience a changed heart. And forgiveness is actually one way that we protect ourselves from future harm because it allows us to experience healing right now. Forgiveness is a gift from God, inviting us to imagine another way is possible, that ours is a story that can have another ending. Believing in a future of healing defiantly proclaims to the hurt, to the hate, to the despair of the world that you will not have the last word. Choosing faith, choosing forgiveness, means believing that the healing, the love, the grace of God will endure. Like many of Jesus' teachings, the premise of this story also runs pretty countercultural, then and now. In the United States, we are living in a particular time where divisiveness, anger, and fear have taken center stage. We are encouraged to push others aside, to be unrelenting and unmoving. We are in this time that easily divides us and stokes flames of fear and discontent and encourages us to be in a constant state of fight or flee rather than peace. Our world seems to encourage us to be like this unmerciful servant, but we know that God calls us to live another way. God knows another way is possible. God imagines a world where where we experience love that is compassionate and generous, where our pain and brokenness can be healed, where we can find new life that is grounded in love. And even when we fall short, or maybe especially when we fall short, God's mercy is ours, inviting us not only to receive God's forgiveness, but to have a wholly changed life. This summer, much of our staff is reading a book together. It's written by a Presbyterian pastor. The name of the book is Everything Good About God is True. Each chapter has its own subject that the pastor is reflecting on and talking about. And one of the chapters is called Healed. And he says this about healing and forgiveness. He writes, "Healing is difficult to describe, but we know it when we feel it. It's like a weight has been lifted off your chest, or you finally have exhaled a breath you've been holding. That moment of unspoken love between two partners after a festering disagreement is past and trust is reclaimed. This is healing. That moment of reconciliation with a family after unhealthy patterns of behavior are acknowledged. This is healing. That moment of understanding within a community after patterns of division and conflict are addressed in ways that allow for growth and acceptance. This is healing. Difficult to describe, but we know it when we feel it," he says. I think forgiveness is so tricky because it's also tied to our relationships with one another. But when we experience it, we make our way down a path that will lead us toward greater peace and joy and confidence. So then how do we become a people who more easily forgive? Aside from the words of Jesus, one person that I look to model and to teach me the way of forgiveness is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. You'll remember him as an Anglican bishop in South Africa, most well known for his anti-apartheid work. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize and has done a great deal of work about what it is to forgive people, especially in situations where there's been immense harm that's been done. And so I've looked to him this week for wisdom on how we might live into these words from Jesus. Desmond Tutu said, "The only way to experience healing and peace is to forgive. Until we forgive, we remain locked in our pain and locked out of possibility of experiencing healing and freedom. We remain locked out of the possibility of being at peace." Now, a quick sidebar before we get into this further. Neither Jesus nor Desmond Tutu is asking us to be an endless well of forgiveness to the detriment of our own well-being. And what I mean by that is that forgiveness does not embrace violence perpetuated against us. Forgiveness does not mean giving free rein to people to do us harm. Forgiveness does not mean accepting oppression or abuse in any kind. But instead, forgiveness is one way that we can find hope and healing. And Desmond Tutu teaches that we can find hope and healing through forgiveness even out of places of incredible suffering and pain. Forgiveness is about a posture of our own hearts where we let go of anger and fear and resentment and we allow God's peace to flourish and grow. This is good for us not only spiritually, but also it is good for our physical well-being and our mental health. There have been numerous studies that point to the fact that carrying anger and resentment and fear is hard physically on our bodies, and that when we practice forgiveness, we can lower our risk of heart attack, we can improve our cholesterol and our blood pressure, we can reduce pain, we can sleep better. We probably all knew that. We can sleep better. But we also, by practicing forgiveness, can make an impact on our levels of anxiety and depression and even PTSD. And so in more than one way, we have been a people who have been made to forgive, to experience and to offer forgiveness. Now, Desmond Tutu offers 4 basic steps for how we can work through this process from being hurt toward finding resolution and peace. The first step, he says, is to tell the story. This is to acknowledge to yourself and to others that you have been deeply hurt. You might talk to yourself, keep a journal, talk to a trusted friend, you might talk to a therapist. Telling your story and uncovering the root of your pain revealing those feelings of shame or embarrassment or betrayal. And when we tell our story over and over again, we increase our resilience, not only for us and our ability to make our way through this path, but also for future generations. Part of the way that we end generational traumas is by telling our story and working through the good and the bad parts of it. The second step is to name the hurt. Now, when you name the hurt, you're just imagining that you're holding the thing in front of you. You're not minimizing it. You are not trying to fix it. You're not trying to push it away. You're just making space for that anger and resentment and pain. And when you name the cause of that pain, you remove some of its power over you, and you begin to clear out some space for healing and hope and peace to grow. And then 𝗂𝗂 says, when you're ready, you can choose to forgive. This is a way that we let go of the pain